Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to paint this jelly bean succulent. I've been asked to paint succulents for several years now, but I felt like I needed a lot of time to study the growth pattern and the foreshortened petal shapes, but I finally have the courage to draw it out in a tutorial today. I've also picked an easy one since the shape of the petal looked more rounded and long, kind of like a jelly bean, but longer. So here, let me try to simplify it for you. I first drew out the pot and I wanted mine to look handmade and rustic, so I didn't really care too much about how even the sides are. I just want to make sure that I like the angle and the opening of the pot so I can showcase the succulent nicely in the painting. In terms of the shape though, you can basically draw out or design any pot that you want. Since I need a bit of space to paint each petal for the succulents, I want to make sure that the succulents are big enough. So I just fitted 3 in this pot and I want the succulents to have different heights for the composition. The one that I'm drawing now is facing towards us, which is why we can see the center of the succulent. Before drawing each petal, I want to make sure the silhouettes are drawn in the correct proportion, so it fits well with everything else. Then I want to start thinking about the center of the succulent so I can sketch out each petal around the stem. For the one facing towards us, I tried to think of it more like flower petals, but we are not able to see the petals underneath since they're more or less the same length. Now for this next one on the left, we can see the succulent from the side this time. But just like before, I always like to start at the center. This way it's much easier to draw each petal growing out of the stem. Don't forget to draw out some petals which are foreshortened and facing towards us, because this will make the composition of those petals look more natural. As for the ones at the center, we can't see them as well since each of the petals are slightly tilted up. So I made them shorter and they're just popping out behind the ones we previously drawn out. It's also easier to draw the petals overlaid on top of each other, and once we're happy with the position, we can then erase those extra lines. Those foreshortened petals can be quite confusing at first, but once you get the idea of it, just think about where it's growing out of. And after a while, I feel like our eyes will adjust to the foreshortened shapes. If, however, you're not interested in the sketching or the drawing portion and want to get straight to painting, I'll also have this outline available in my Ko-fi shop to download. For this last one, I'm drawing another succulent from the side view, starting from the center again. This way I can imagine where I want each petal to start and end, which is actually the trick for you to imagine those foreshortened petals. You can draw a small circle where the petal would start from the stem, and a slightly larger one where you want the tip or the petal to end. Once you've established those 2 points, you can then connect those 2 circles together and outline it, and that will establish the placement of your foreshortened petals. And that's basically all it takes for this specific succulent petal, since the shape is fairly simple. And once you've practiced with that method, it's much easier to visualize it straight away without drawing those actual guidelines. I've basically drawn out most of the petals here. I just want to clean out the final ones, making sure that the edges look kind of uneven and they all have different lengths and slightly different angles. This way the placement of those petals look more natural. Once the placement of the petals are finalized, I want to clean out the outline and also add a little bit of detail to the pot. To clean out the lines, I like to erase a section at a time and then just fixing those areas and relining it with my pencil in just one stroke, making the line less scratchy and also very light so it doesn't show through when I paint later on. Now let's move on to the color. I'll be using Hooker's Green by Cotman, Permanent Green by Holbein, Shone Brilliant by Holbein, Quin Red by Daniel Smith, Hansa Yellow Light by Daniel Smith, Sepia by Holbein, and Payne's Grey Bluish by Schmincke. I am also going to use Bleed Proof White by Dr. P.H. Martens for extra highlights. Now let's begin to paint. I'm using my Filbert brush here just so it's much easier to get those rounded edges, but you can also use a round brush. You just have to use the tip to first create an outline instead of using the pressure of your brush to create the round edge. For the succulent, I'm starting with a light yellow-green and a really thin consistency, and this is from a mix of permanent green and Hansa yellow light. I started with a really light base using that yellow-green mix. Then while the surface is still damp, I added the pink tips, which is from a mix of Quin Red and Jaune Brilliant Dark. For the pink tips, I use a medium consistency. Then for the bottom, I use a slightly darker green by mixing Hooker's Green with the permanent green and Hansa yellow light. I want to soften the blend of these three colors, and it's okay if it looks kind of light at the moment because we're just going to be layering little by little since I don't want to lose the vibrancy of the colors, and I also don't want to make it too dark and muddy. After painting the base color for a few of these, I like to separate them using that darker green again along the edges. Once I had a better gauge of how dark I want the green to be for the first application, I'm using a slightly thicker consistency now, and I'm only painting the bottom bit so I don't mix the green into the pink. Instead, there's only an area between those two colors where the transition's being made, and I'm doing this all in a really light brush load so those areas are drying fairly quickly and I don't have to wait too long in between. I want the red tips to pop out, so I like to add a little bit more pigment little by little and then just softening the edge using a clean damp brush so the red tips look more vibrant than the green areas. For this particular succulent that I'm painting, especially these two petals, it's quite foreshortened, so the area of the pink will be almost at the center where you can see the green radially outlining the pink area. Here I'm enhancing the pink a little bit more and just letting the color flow together, and if the base is too dry, I just use a clean damp brush to help soften the blend. Once I've painted all of the base color, I use the same pink mixture, but this has more Quin Red in the ratio. And you can see that the red is a little bit more vibrant than the base color. And I'm just going to place this right at the very tip, so there's more contrast between the green and the red tips. And just like before, if the base color is already completely dry and you can see that the edges of these pink areas are too sharp, I'm just going to soften the transition with a clean damp brush. So those are the steps to paint the base color of the succulent, but I'm going to layer on a little bit more of the detail and redefine all of those shapes later on. I'm just going to paint the base color for this last succulent using the same method. Next, I'm going to increase the vibrancy of the red tips. So here I'm using the pink mixture with more Quin Red in the ratio. And just placing it over, you can see that the base color is now completely dry, but that's fine. I'm just going to keep painting the tips and then I'm going to use a clean damp brush to soften the blend. We've pretty much painted the base color for all of those petals, so now I'm going to work on the next layer. I'm using the previous green mixture, and at the bottom I added some Hooker's Green, so I have better access to the darker green as well. You can see that the base color is completely dry, so the shadow that I'm painting in between those succulents have really sharp edges. This way I can really separate those petals without worrying about the colors blending together. For the bigger shadows, I like to use the light green mixture and the darker green for the areas closer to the bottom of those petals, as they're bunching up together so it looks deeper and further away and in shadow. I also like to use the darker green for the shadows underneath the petals, as it's catching less light. For the stem of the succulent peeking through, I want to make sure that I'm using a muted dark green color so it doesn't take away from the brightness of the petals. To darken this area, I want the green to be muted, so I added some sepia into the mixture, and at the bottom, I like to put just a dash of Quin Red to keep it consistent with the rest of the succulent, but I don't want the color to be too vibrant, so of course I mix it with a little bit of sepia as well. I can start to see the succulent structure pretty well by now, but I'm just going to increase the contrast and also sharpen some of the details, especially for the really tight corners with that dark green mix. After adding the dark green, now I see that the red needs a bit more pop of color. This is why I like to go back and forth in little layers. It's just so much easier to build the colors slowly if there are really light colors involved. I don't want this to look overly vibrant, but I want the contrast in the soft pastel color and the vibrant pink. Then after adding on that extra layer of red, I also darken the stem so it balances out with the rest of the succulents that we've painted. At first, I thought I wanted the soil to be covered in pebbles, but I ended up going over the gray area with a dark brown so the succulent color can stand out more. For the brown, I used a mix of sepia and Quin Red. After painting the base color in a medium to thin consistency, I went over those areas again, also clearing out some of the edges around the succulents using a thicker consistency of the same brown. I also left out a bit of space for the rim. Next, I'm going to paint the pot. I want the color to be fairly neutral and I want the main hue to be purple but a little bit muted, so I used a mix of Payne's Grey Bluish with Quin Red and a little bit of Jaune Brilliant. I started out by evenly dampening the surface except for the rim and the bottom part. Then I used a thin consistency of the color that I've already pre-mixed to paint along the edges as well as under the rim and under the succulent. I don't want the color of the pot to be too dark, so I always make sure that I'm using a light consistency, so I can always layer on a bit more pigment on top if I ever need to. I want to also slightly darken the bottom and then softening it so the pot looks rounded. Then for the pattern, I'm going to create those lines that I initially sketched out before, following the curvature of the pot to make it look more plump. Here I'm adding another layer in a thin consistency still to darken the bottom part, and I also want to soften the blend. Here I'm introducing a brighter hue to the pot, so I mixed in more Quin Red into the ratio. I'm just using a light consistency, so only little parts of it has the purple. I want to also start coloring the rim slightly and add some cast shadow underneath the succulents. For these parts, it's much easier to work on the dry surface so I can get the really clean edges than just softening the blend using a clean damp brush, so it's much easier to control how much you want the paint to travel. Now that the pot is taking shape and the color is nice and light, this is when I'm a little bit more brave with the shadow, especially for the bottom. Here I'm using a medium consistency, and you can see that the color is a bit more blue this time because it has more Payne's Gray Bluish in the ratio. I like to add some of the finer details using my size 0 brush here, so it's easy to paint in between those really tight corners for the soil. And then I'm going to go back to the bottom of the pot using the same mixture in a medium to light consistency, so it looks darker than the rest of the pot. I'm going to add another layer of the red tips. This time I want the red to be very vibrant since I'm mostly happy with the form of the succulents, so I'm using a thick consistency of just Quin Red without the Jaune Brilliant. I'm just painting it right at the very tip using my small brush, and I left out a little bit of a dot in the middle that will serve as highlight. Then I'm going to soften the blend again using a clean damp brush, so there will be no hard edges. Next, I'm going to paint the cast shadow underneath the pot, and I'm starting by dampening the surface. I'm using a really thick consistency of Payne's Gray Bluish, applying it right at the very bottom of the pot, then continuing with a clean damp brush to soften the edges. I'm also going to use a thin consistency of Payne's Gray Bluish to paint some cast shadows underneath the succulents. With again that thin consistency, I'm just going to add some extra textures at the bottom of the pot. Then using the purple mix, so this is from Payne's Gray Bluish and a little bit of Quin Red, I'm just going to define the shape of the pot further by lining those curved lines. Just for an extra detail to the design, I'm going to add some red dots on the pot in different sizes using a medium to thin consistency of just the Quin Red. This is just to complement the red dots on the jelly bean succulents. I feel like the color of the pot is a bit boring, so I'm going to attempt to bring some life by introducing a warm tone. I used a mix of Quin Red, Jaune Brilliant, and a bit of Hansa Yellow Light in a light consistency just to glaze on the side, the curved lines, and the rim. Here I'm going to fix the form and round the corners at the bottom where the lines meet. This will give some volume to each of those curved lines. Then I'm just going to define and create some final adjustments for the rest of the painting until I'm happy with the vibrancy, the contrast in value, and so on. For this part, I made sure to use my very small brush. This way I can get right to the very small corners and the very tight spaces to define the shape and form of those petals further. For the outlines that I'm making here, I used a muted dark green mix from Hooker's Green, Hansa Yellow Light, and I also added some sepia so the green is more muted and doesn't take away from the vibrancy of the succulents. Instead, the muted color should help enhance those bright colors. For the very last step, I want these to look shiny, so I'm going to add some highlights using bleed proof white for some of those plump succulents. I'm not going to do this for every single one though, because it might look overworked. I like to place a white dot at the very tip and add a line following the curvature of the petals. And if the white is somewhat too strong, I like to use a slightly thinner consistency and just taking the excess off with tissue. Sometimes I want some of the highlights to look a little bit blurry, and for that I'll just use a clean damp brush to rub some of the edges. And as the last final touch-up, I'm going to add a little bit of splatters at the bottom near the shadow using a medium to thin consistency of Payne's Gray Bluish. And that's basically it for this painting. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box, along with the link to the outline as well. If you guys are still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!